That's the one. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming on this early rainy day. That means that the partying last night wasn't too good. Um, I'm going to talk about kind of a type of data set that is kind of on the outskirts, I think, of what most of the other papers have been about. So we're looking at acoustics, we're looking at 3D acoustics, we're looking at architecture and defining the acoustics of materials as opposed to the color of materials. So it kind of opens up a whole new genre of data that I don't think is being talked about in the data space, which was kind of the nature of some of the questions that were asked yesterday. But what I want to give today is kind of an overview of some examples of how we've used this data in both scientific research and also in kind of community outreach. So just as a brief overview, so I'm an acoustician, I'm an acoustic researcher. I work in how you hear where things come from. I work in room acoustics, and I work in virtual reality and specifically virtual acoustic reality. Whoops, that way. Um, so research in room acoustics is very interdisciplinary. I mean, we can look at the physics of things, but we can also get into the psychoacoustics. So how do I perceive what's happening? And then we can also get into music and architecture. So it becomes that kind of broad idea. If I now bring in heritage, which is kind of one of the keys of this conference, then we can bring in other disciplines such as historians, art historians, musicology, archaeology, sociology. And if I take one example, which is a historically informed performance, that's kind of a growing movement of musicians who try and play music from certain epochs with instruments or facsimiles of instruments from those periods in the style of those periods, tuned to those periods. And what we've noticed is that no one's really paid attention to where they play. So if I take the example of kind of Baroque chamber music, right now, okay, it was written and performed in the Queen's Music Chamber, but when we go to hear it now, we go and listen to it in a concert hall or in a chamber music hall. And one of the questions that we've asked in a previous project was, do the musicians actually play differently in one room or in the other? And that's kind of linked to kind of the questions that we're asking and how we bring this cultural heritage into the concept of acoustics. I keep clicking it in the wrong place. There we go. So just as a brief overview, for those of you who weren't at the introduction workshop, what is acoustics? So acoustics is sound moving in the air. The acoustics of an architecture is kind of the audible character of that building, and we can think of it as the intangible result of all of the tangible decisions that the architect and the decorators have made. The room's acoustics impacts, affects, and completes any kind of sound that's made in the room. And if we think about it in a way, we can't examine the acoustics of a space unless we make sound. It'd be like trying to look at a painting in a dark room with no lights. But unlike light, sound also changes in time. So when we kind of do simulations, it's kind of different from light simulations in computer graphics, where we have to look at not only where does the sound arrive, but also when does it arrive, because it comes at different times. And so, as I said before, so I want to give kind of an overview of a couple of projects. I'm not going to get into very much technical details, just some keywords, and I'm hoping that we can have questions afterwards, because I'm not exactly sure what aspects of it are going to interest you most. So I want to make sure that we leave time for that. So as most of you are probably aware, there was this kind of accident a couple years ago that the Notre Dame Cathedral caught fire. Most of it, luckily, has been saved and is in the process of being restored. But there was some damage on the roof, the spire, some of the vaults. There was damage to the floor. There was water damage to various aspects as well. But at the time, we didn't know that it was going to actually survive so well as it has today. And so there, at the time, there was a lot of concerns kind of about what was, have we lost the acoustics of Notre Dame? And were there any records of it? And what can we do to fix it? And this kind of links to some other fires that have happened over the past decade or two, such as in Italy, with some very famous opera houses being destroyed. So we in France, and also with some colleagues in England and in Europe, I mean, Italy, kind of quickly got together and put together some research proposals to try and do something. So around Notre Dame, there was kind of an assembly of CNRS researchers that created the Chantier Scientifique, which is kind of the scientific advisory board to the reconstruction site, and we founded the Acoustics and Soundscape group within that. And then we also I haven't heard anybody mention it, the JPICH, which is the European Joint Project Initiative on Cultural Heritage, which also gives funding for cultural heritage-based research. And we have a project with them called the Past as Years, looking at kind of acoustic heritage, how to document it, how to model it, and what can we do with it. And then in France, we have a specific project that's an extension of that, looking only at Notre Dame. So to kind of give a bit of backstory, so a couple years before the fire, we'd actually already had a project in Notre Dame, and the idea was to kind of recreate a monumental concert. So this was a concert that was for the 850th anniversary of Notre Dame. It had hundreds of musicians and choir all distributed everywhere, but it was kind of a one-time event. It was playing La Vierge de Massenet, which he actually wrote for Notre Dame on a competition at the time. And the idea was to kind of create a virtual version of this that wasn't like listening to the radio, but it would be like actually being there. So a real 3D reconstruction of that concert. And we had a proof of concept idea to kind of make a YouTube 360 video, which had just come out at that time, supporting 3D audio format. And so that was kind of our project. I keep forgetting to point at wherever the hidden thing is. So this was our first kind of foray into this. So this was the Ghost Orchestra project. And the idea was to make a little kind of magic carpet ride where you could fly around Notre Dame over the concert and kind of hear how the acoustics changes depending where you are relative to the orchestra and relative to the building. So in order to do that, what do we need? So we need the sounds of the instruments and the musicians. So we have a very close mic system and recorded all the different instruments. And that's what you see on the left. So there was, I think, 45 tracks of instruments for all the sections. Then we have to create a digital twin of the room, which you see up there. So that's our acoustic 3D model. So a different kind of 3D model than was talked about earlier this morning. In kind of the day set space. And then from all those, then we also have a visual rendering. So we kind of texture that up and make it look nice so we have something to look to. And then we can combine that all into a virtual reality experience. So here's a QR code for that if anybody wants to look at it. And I have a little excerpt of it, which I think they said I need to click one more time. Can you turn that up a bit? Jump over that. I mean, it's meant to be listened to over headphones with dynamic rotation. So either on your phone, if it has an accelerometer, or on YouTube 360, even on a computer, you can move around and look. And that was kind of the way we did. But in order to do that project, you have to make this digital twin. Has been talked about, and how to do that. So we have the modeling aspects, so we need the geometry, we need to define the properties of all the materials, and then we also make measurements in the space to kind of quantify the acoustics of the moment, and then we can calibrate that model to be accurate. And from that, we can then recalculate new positions of microphones and speakers that weren't in the original measurements. So we can kind of extend our data set through this calibrated digital twin. As part of that, we also need material properties. New construction materials are often, you're able to find kind of what the acoustic definitions of those are. And it's kind of the same as color and texture that we have on things, but we're talking about the acoustic frequency. So which frequencies are more or less absorbed or reflected. So we can look at it that way. But when we're doing a historic project, there isn't actually data on a lot of these materials. So we had to go, for example, to the Louvre and they let us go in and measure some 14th, 15th, 16th century tapestries that were comparable to what was in Notre Dame at different times, and also to some of the archives of other materials. This is a giant carpet that actually covers the entire choir area of Notre Dame that has only come out, I think the last time was when Pope John Paul II visited France. And it's now in the middle of restoration, and we'll probably go back in at the opening of Notre Dame, and they let us get in and measure that as well. So that was kind of exciting. So that creates a whole new set of data that is not really typical to the general community, but in acoustics, it's quite important for what we're doing. So then we get into the second project. So this was during COVID. Reconstruction has started. We're all excited about working on Notre Dame, and then they say you can't leave your house. So I don't know how confinement was here. We were limited to, I think, a couple hundred meters from our apartment for about a year. So that gave us time to say, what else could we do on the anniversary of Notre Dame that would be interesting and give people who are stuck at home something to do? So we took that 5-minute extract that was in the YouTube video and produced the entire concert. So that's about an hour and a half. We did it only as a radio production. We got rid of kind of the dynamic aspects, and basically you can just sit and listen to your headphones like you're listening to the radio. But then what we added was that you could pick where you wanted to sit. So we gave these kind of four positions that you could sit, and then also the sound engineer's artistic mix. So you could kind of compare if you heard it on the radio and it was broadcast, what you would get, but then if you were actually on site, what would you get, and depending where you were. And then we also had a questionnaire and a couple of things like that so we could get some data, because we like to do a little science from time to time. But what's interesting is with these digital twins and these computer simulations, the power of them is once you have one, you can change it. So what we can do is say, well, we have a great model of what was happening like in 2015, which is kind of where we calibrate our model. And we know that the architecture and the decorations of Notre Dame has changed over centuries. So what we can do is redo computer models and change that calibrated model and recreate all these previous states of Notre Dame. And so that's what we've done. And the idea is to look at how the acoustics has changed and how that interacts with other uses. So we can look at how preaching has changed. We can look at how singing has changed. In addition to kind of the building, we can look at how the use of the building has changed. So for example, the choir used to sing from one area. The preaching was really dedicated only to the really holy of the holies, who all sat in this little area. And then things opened up and the preaching had to go to the general public. The singing was now meant for the general public, and where the singer was changed. We can look at the organ. So for example, this is the current organ. But before that, there was a medieval organ that was somewhere in the cathedral that could have resembled something like that. And that's a bit of research that we're trying to figure out. So these are all things that we can also investigate in our simulations of kind of the historic states of Notre Dame. And in doing so, we've actually created a lot of content on the research side. So we have recorded choir singers singing Gregorian chants, monophonic music, polyphonic music. We have a children's choir that we actually got in and mic'd up and recorded in our large anechoic studio. And we also developed a tool for engineers and other researchers to be able to move around in the digital space and hear how things would have sounded at different places. And we also have some researchers on soundscapes, so kind of creating what the background noise and the ambience was at different parts in history. And these are all used in our research studies, but then the idea was to say, well, how can we actually distribute this out to the general public so it doesn't stay just in our drawers of scientists? And because Notre Dame is kind of known, we're kind of even under more obligation to share this with other people. So conferences like this are nice. I get to talk about what we did, but whatever I share is limited to the number of people that are here or the few people that are online. We can do journal publications where we can get into details, but that's even less kind of aimed at the general public. So kind of following what we did with the YouTube 360, which was kind of an internal little project, and the web audio experience, we wanted to get into kind of what other aspects and abilities could we do, and could we do it a little more professionally. i.e. not me and my two students kind of whipping something up on the weekends or things like that. So the first idea we had was to do a radio fiction. And the idea was to say, here's all this content, let's give it to some creative people and say, write me a story that would be neat to listen to as a radio podcast that uses all of the science and the results of what we have and uses all this content that we have. So we gave them a lot of liberty in what they could do, but just kind of listed out the points that we wanted them to hit. And the result of that is this podcast that came out, I think, almost a year ago. And they created a story basically around the idea of Victor Hugo is writing his novel. He has writer's block, and he gets visited by a muse that is kind of like the young embodiment of the cathedral, who takes him through history to experience different moments in the cathedral's history to help get him inspired, and then he writes and things like that. And in doing so, he goes to Notre Dame on different occasions, he meets singers, he meets the clergy, and all of those things that are happening in Notre Dame in the story are happening in our calibrated virtual simulation. And I think I need to ask for that to be played because it doesn't work on the clicker, if I'm right.
Audible presents Looking for Notre Dame, an immersive 3D sound series produced by Narrative, directed by Laurence Courtois, and written by Timothée de Fontbelle and Nelly Labert. You will hear historical acoustic reconstructions of the cathedral over the centuries, created as part of a multidisciplinary research project coordinated by Brian Katz, Sorbonne University, arising from the terrible fire suffered by Notre Dame. In order to fully enjoy the audio 3D, we recommend headphones.
I thought about my editor, who had sought me out in the darkness of Notre Dame, where I prowled from morning to night to escape my desk.
1,000 franc penalty per week for overdue work. That's what you're in for, Hugo, if you don't give me that manuscript. 1,000!
And this story that's resisting you, what will it be called?
Notre Dame de Paris.
February the 1st, young man. Not a day later. You have 5 months left!
I sometimes think my big forehead holds a huge machine with cogs, wheels, pulleys, winches and gears. A machine for building stories and traveling through time. And Notre Dame de Paris occupied it all. A symphony. All the sounds of the cathedral from the earliest times. Each wave of time contributes its layer. Each generation deposits theirs on the monument. Each individual brings their stone. Thus do the beavers, thus do the bees, thus do men.
Oops, sorry for the clicking on the fade in, fade out, the editor I was using. So what I wanted you to hear in that was the moment when he's talking to his editor, and that's a discussion that's happening in Notre Dame, and he's tapping his cane, and you can hear it resonate in Notre Dame. There's also the moment when you're hearing the construction, and we have a team that has gone out to work sites with people using traditional tools and elements in the reconstruction of Notre Dame that were recorded. So people using traditional stone cutting, traditional glass blowing, and all of those sounds that are historically accurate were put into the context of recreating kind of the construction site in the 12th century, and then the choir singing at the end. The next one that was kind of interesting was a New York Times article that came to just talk about the reconstruction efforts. And the multimedia department at the New York Times was interested in getting into kind of interactive, immersive media content on their media newspaper page. They'd already done some graphical immersive stuff, and they saw kind of the article inside their little desk when it circulates, and they thought this would be the moment to try and get into 3D audio. So we worked with them for about 6 months getting the content right, the story to kind of follow the path of what we could provide. And they made this very interesting interactive web page where you fly through Notre Dame and you can hear different things happening at different moments, mostly a children's choir that we synthesized for them at different moments. And all geared around a web interface, not a head tracker and not moving, but just using the pan of the scroll bar, which was kind of a neat aspect. And I think that got a lot of feedback around the world. It was quite interesting. Almost the last one is a immersive audio guide. So while the podcast was interesting and it kind of gave some hints of what was going on, I didn't really feel that it was communicating the actual research and the acoustics that we wanted to. So we started now working with an audio guide, interactive audio guide company that was interested in doing a geolocalized audio guide so we could walk around Notre Dame because it's still closed to the public. And as you walk around, it presents information at different places relative to what you can see, all translated into kind of a layperson's moment. You can choose which things you want to listen to, because I think at the moment we have 12 different spots, and you can listen to the first one, and if you want more information or more detail on a topic, you can stay, so it gives some kind of dynamics to people. It's all done in 3D audio, so it's made for headphones. The idea is that you're not looking at your phone, you're just kind of walking from point to point, and then you can listen. And again, we gave a lot of artistic liberty to the team about how they wanted to write it, and it's about 50% acoustics and 50% just more of the history of Notre Dame. So the result of that is the Whispers of the Past at Notre Dame, which should be coming out at the end of the year on Android and iOS. It's free, kind of funded by our research projects in English, French, and Spanish. And the idea is that it's kind of extensible, modifiable quite easily as an application. So if the path route changes because of the construction and we can't see something, we can update that and create the new application. So it's kind of dynamic that way. And we're already kind of anticipating the new generation of tracked headphones so that we can have an even more interactive experience. And I think this will play. So this is just a little bit of the intro of how we decided to do it.
Hello. I apologize for my current state. I'm aware that I don't look my best covered in scaffolding like a cloak. You see, I'm still in the process of recovery. They call it under restoration. Experts are attending to me diligently. They are observing, studying, and repairing me. Soon I'll open my doors to you again, and the fire that scarred my flesh will be nothing but a distant memory. I've heard that you are in search of beautiful stories. That's perfect. As the old lady that I am, I have plenty to share. 9 centuries of memories offer numerous possibilities. But where to begin? I know. How about taking a little stroll? I suggest we tour the property and pause from time to time to observe me. You'll see, these privileged viewpoints have the power to bring forth my memories, my most vibrant memories, the ones that can be heard. Let's dive together into the echoes of my past. Let's listen to the music of my pipe organs, the songs of the greatest artists, the whispered prayers, the rhythms of my builder's tools, and the ringing of my bells. Oh, I'm already looking forward to it. So, if you'd like, let's start by settling down on the parvis, on the stands, for example, and let's go back to the very beginning of my story.
So the idea is in the experience, you go around and you hear, it's gone now. There was the little picture of the rosace window. So each one of the little medallions on the rosace window corresponds to part of the story. And once you've listened to it, it becomes colored. So you can kind of see your progression and fill it out. And I think at the end, you get to download it as a little back drop on your screen if you like in high resolution. So the last part is actually the part that we're spending most of the time in is actually using all these kind of reconstructions for historic research. So as I mentioned in the beginning, the architecture has changed over the years. And at the same time, the architecture of Notre Dame was growing. There was an emerging style of music, polyphonic music, that was also happening at Notre Dame. So we're kind of interested into the link between the development of that music and the changing in the architecture. So what we can look at is, for example, how the singers, of course singers today, but singers trying to sing in that style of music, is there any building that's easier for them to sing into? And that could give kind of an indication of the pertinence of the architecture and the link to the singing. And then we can also take the audience point of view and say, does the music sound better as a public, as an audience member in any of those different buildings? And that's something that we're in the middle of doing. But the key bit is to actually create this interactive environment where I can have singers all singing together like they naturally would, but actually with headphones on, and they're being projected into the acoustics of Notre Dame and getting that real live feedback from it. And this choir, luckily, had already sung in Notre Dame and gave us direct feedback of, does it sound like they remembered it? A bit of a time delay, but you can kind of judge the naturalness of it quite well that way. So this is something that we're in the middle of doing. And then I just want to acknowledge that I'm definitely not alone on this project. So this is all of my students and collaborators that are in acoustics. These are all the people that are not acousticians that are working on our project, in terms of historians and musicologists, creators of the different podcasts and arting, and the musicians, and then the cathedral that lets us go in and do things when we want. That's always good. And then here's some web links to different things kind of that I've mentioned, and I'm happy to take any questions. I don't know.
Thank you so much.
I don't know if I'm early or fast. Usually I talk really fast. I try to slow it down.
We've got time for questions, so that's
Okay.
great. I absolutely loved how you brought Notre Dame to life, literally, and also in your research. Having her sound like an old British lady, I think, was a really good choice.
The French version, she doesn't sound British. I will say that.
That makes sense, yeah. that would have been weird, yeah. Do we have any questions in the room for Dr. Brian Katz? We have one in the back. Can we have the catch box, please? Maybe one of you can.
I can hurl it all.
Yep.
No, I think I'd take out a few of the light bulbs up there.
In the back left there, yeah. Good throw.
Didn't lose a
think
light
that-
bulb. I think that was the key bit.
Yeah.
How you? I haven't understand which technology you exactly use to capture the acoustic of the Notre Dame.
So the measurements, we have a set of microphones and a set of speakers that we move around. We use both kind of normal omnidirectional speakers, omnidirectional microphones. We've also done dummy head recordings. We've also used 3D microphones, which are ambisonic microphones, if that means anything to you. I can get into more of the technical details of
And
the
then
sounds
process
that
it-
we do,
and
but
then
we've also
process it-
done gunshots and balloon
And-
bursts.
And then process it with which software in order to have this acoustic model?
So the acoustic model, we're using Cat Acoustic, which is a software used a lot in the consulting field for predicting the acoustics of unbuilt buildings. And then we've worked with the developer of that, and basically while a consultant will kind of run a simulation that may take an hour or a day, we're running things that may take a week or a month to kind of get the high resolution quality out of that. And that gives us the impulse response, which we then put through a convolution engine, which is, I think, was mentioned at the workshop 2 days ago. And we've developed our own kind of interactive convolution engine that lets you walk around.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Which
that
is
question.
also available for free for anybody who wants to try that.
talking about that, I have a question from online that asks. They said it was very interesting, and thank you. They also ask, can I ask about the cost of the audio production? So I know there's multiple productions that you've created, but maybe you could focus on how much it would cost to create that that app that is coming out.
So the both the radio fiction and the audio guide are kind of interesting because as the researchers we're creating a lot of content and a lot of material, which is under the cost of the research project, and then we're paying a production company to do the rest. So the story writing and filling in all the pieces. So if you wanted to do it from scratch, you'd have to do all of that. So the cost would be significantly higher than what we're doing now. And so on the podcast, we got co-funding from Audible as a R&D project, so that they host it and give it for free. So it's, I don't know, it's hard to say exactly what the real costs are. Not 20 euros.
A little bit more, yeah.
A little bit more.
Yeah. But great to hear that you got funding from Audible to help release that.
Yeah,
really
the producer, Cecile Cross, was able to negotiate with them and got them interested, and it was kind of a new project on the Audible R&D side.
Lovely. I saw some more hands. Maybe the gentleman over there, you can catch. Perfect.
That was close.
Can you stand up if you ask
Sure,
a question?
yes.
Thank you.
Thanks for a wonderful talk. So while you were talking, I was thinking also of a colleague of mine who is investigating texts that describe old Marrakesh market, and they have very sort of immersive descriptions of this market, especially of the sounds. So I was just curious, do you think that the type of acoustic generation that you do, careful sort of constructing this, could also work on spaces that you could not have been at and set up your microphones, but sort of build these from descriptions of sounds?
Sure. I mean, there's different aspects to it. So one is architecturally. So if we can't get to the actual building, do we have something that's similar? So I'm sure we could find some other marketplace to give us a first attempt. So in Notre Dame, for example, Sarah Beth, my student who's working on that, went so far back as to create the church that was there before Notre Dame, which was made in the similar style to a church that's in Italy that was measured by some acousticians there. So she basically made a model of that, calibrated it, and then adapted it to what we think it would have been. So architecturally, that's quite easy to do. And we've also done some buildings that we've never been to, but kind of once you understand how the physics and making the model works, you can make some educated guesses. People aren't using materials that have never been used before. So you can always find bits and pieces. And then on the soundscape aspect, to make the sounds of the market, Milen Parduen is kind of our main researcher on soundscape, and she's already done things like creating the city noisecape of Paris in I think it's the 17th century, where you actually are walking through some of the alleyways around like butchers and candlestick makers and carpenters, and she's trying to recreate that environment using historical information, whether it's textual information or drawings or paintings, to try and pick out what would have been happening at that time. So I think you could easily do something, well, easily. Yes, you could do something like that in almost any place, yeah.
For 20 euros.
For a little more than 20 euros.
Go for it, check it. Lovely.
Ah, my neck, ow. Sorry.
You okay, Joe?
Hi. Up, in, other way up, this way around. Hand up. You stand up. Oh, I stand up.
You stand up.
I'm loud enough sitting down. Now, what was my question? I'm going to nick that last thing that you did, because I think that'd be great for audio tours of museums, working with the visually impaired and things like that. So I'll have that. But my question was, how are you feeding this back, or are you feeding it back into the rebuild of Notre Dame? And I'm sorry if I missed it.
I didn't mention it.
Ah.
As far as the audio guide is concerned, I definitely invite you to talk to the talkative group, which are the ones making that audio guide. Um, Linking with the reconstruction of Notre Dame on the research side, the most so in the beginning of after the fire, there was a lot of discussion about some really crazy ideas for the restoration, up to like glass roof with a park on top and things like that. In the very beginning, we were very much active trying to talk to them, saying, we have these tools, we're there to answer questions, but we can predict what the effects of any of these things will be. And then it was quite soon after that that President Macron came out and said, we're going to build it the way it was. So all of those fears of big changes kind of went away, which led us focus more on the history side as opposed to the panic of you're not going to build a glass bubble inside. Having said that, the choir organ, while the large organ survived the fire, the choir organ didn't. It was too damaged from water and things falling because it's right near the transept. And it also wasn't a classified monument. So they were looking at already before the fire to make a bigger organ, to change the orientation of the organ so that it projects more into the nave. So what we were able to do with our digital twin was to take the proposals of the organ builders of how they thought they could solve the problem and actually look at the acoustic results of those different propositions and give that to the restoration team to help them make their decision of which organ they wanted. So that's been the closest contact with that, as well as what Milan is doing, which is very much documenting for cultural heritage, for lack of a better word, the acoustic kind of soundscape of the reconstruction. So she has a set of microphones that are running continually anytime there's people working. And the idea is to kind of create that as an acoustic memory with documentation of how things are evolving, and then being able to compare that to what did a construction site in the 12th century sound like, or the reconstruction by Vieux-le-Duc, which someone mentioned yesterday, talking about different ideas for how to restore things. So those are kind of the two aspects, I would say.
We have a lot of questions and interest online as well. A lot of cultural heritage professionals that are working in institutions that are mostly asking the same questions. So I'm going to group them together a little bit. It mostly comes down to people wanting to know how they can find possible paths for an institution like a museum, for instance, to get into acoustics heritage more. Outside of maybe just contacting you, what would be?
It's a good start.
It's a good start. I agree.
I don't quite understand the question.
No worries at all. So there's people asking you, how can a cultural organization learn a bit more about how they could use acoustics in, for instance, their storytelling experience? How can they enhance their own collections with acoustics heritage? Where would they start, basically, is the question.
Well, that's a good question. It depends kind of what kind of institution and what your material is. I mean, if you're a printing press museum, it would be quite different than if you were like a stained glass window museum, I think. I mean, there's definitely companies that are doing this, like the narrative and talkative that we've worked with, that are motivated by that. There's a number of researchers around Europe easily. So for example, we're working with the University of York that's highly active in kind of archaeoacoustics in England, the University of Parma in Italy. There's also groups in Spain and a number of other countries that at least would be a good first dialogue of, what's the interesting aspects of the acoustics of what we have and what can be gone forward. I was talking to a gentleman at breakfast who's at a musical instrument museum, and they're looking at doing synthesis of those instruments that you can't play, and actually making virtual recordings of elements in their exhibit. And that could also be even integrated into where were those instruments played. So now I can have a simulation of the room acoustics, and you could actually create kind of a whole virtual performance.
That sounds amazing. I think we should do that for every instrument museum out there. I have a question I would like to ask, because of course we're here with a bunch of cultural heritage institutions, and Europeana is all about preserving and giving access to heritage. I was wondering, how can we preserve the research and the outputs of your work? We can, when we preserve, music, it's just uploading an MP3 as an object with its metadata. But when we're talking about, binaural experience and 360 3D audio, what is the preservation side of this?
So that's kind of a tricky thing at the moment. The data spaces that we were talking about yesterday at the moment they're just starting to become adapted to 3D data. They're not at all adapted to 3D acoustic data. And I think that's a big issue that we need to talk about. The format of the files, what's even in that information. So when we do a geometric acoustic model, there's the geometry and then there's all the material definitions. And looking at the different software that would use that, it's not uniform at the moment. Different softwares are looking for different information. So there is no kind of uniform standard in that way. So I know there's Europeana Sounds, and that's one possibility. We were kind of talking to them. Gregory contacted me a couple months ago about this kind of unified format, and I think it's still something that's lacking. And then if we just take the example of 3D, of a 3D image or a 3D data, in visual, you can turn around and the model isn't affected by kind of lighting. You can move the lighting around. Whereas in acoustics, the measurement that we do in a building is a function of where the speaker was and where the microphone was. And so both of those need to be stored in the data. And if I already look at visual image, it never says where the camera was. That's not important, or where the lighting was, or what kind of lighting. Was it a homogeneous lighting, or was it a spotlight? And that doesn't really affect as much kind of the visual data or the geometrical data, but in acoustics, that would change everything. So the data standards need to kind of accept more of this complexity, and at the moment they don't.
Right. Seems like we have a lot of discussing and work to do to be able to preserve your research. Thank you so much one more time, Brian Katz, for your keynote. Let's give him a warm hand.